I knew something was off the moment our Chief Technology Officer, Stephen Finch, tripped over himself in the hallway, trying to impress the new Director of Operations. Stephen has 3 patents and a doctorate in computer science, but there he was, nervously pointing at fire exit signage like it was a museum masterpiece. That was how Bradley Cole arrived on a red carpet of brown nosing and nervous laughter. And me, I was the invisible guy, holding the actual foundation together. You know, minor things like the documents that kept our liability insurance valid, the compliance systems that stopped our investors from suing us, and the audit protocols no one ever read, unless the building was metaphorically on fire. My name is Gavin Vance. I do risk and compliance. I do not do corporate flair. I do not do morning stand-up meetings. I do not circle back, and if someone tries to give me a cupcake on my birthday, I file a quiet human resources flag for attempted manipulation. But I do know where every risk assessment lies, who is overdue on their mandatory training, and how to read the fine print on policies that could bankrupt this company in less time than it takes Henry from sales to forget his own password again. I had been here 7 years, outlasting 3 chief technology officers, 2 chief executive officers, and 1 power-drunk vice president who once suggested we skip quarterly reviews to foster agility. That man now works in New Mexico selling combat boots. He learned the hard way that when you ignore the structural safety nets of a corporation, the fall is always swift and undignified. They called me the compliance guy. Never Gavin, never boss. Just the man with the scary clipboard who ruined launch parties by asking where the updated vendor indemnity forms were. Legal counsel loved me because I saved them from constant litigation. Operations ignored me, which was fine by me until they hired Bradley Cole. Anyway, when the memo went out that we were welcoming a new director of operations with a fresh vision, I was in the middle of updating our vendor certification files for the annual insurance review. Nothing says Friday night like chasing down a 4th-tier subcontractor security report while eating peanut butter crackers in a windowless office. I did not care about corporate vision. I cared about the fact that our liability renewal was due in 27 days, and one wrong checkbox could turn our whole year into a lawsuit. Bradley Cole arrived Monday morning with the kind of swagger you usually only see on guys who think LinkedIn is a social media dating site. He wore cologne that made the hallway smell like a shopping mall clothing store and introduced himself by clapping his hands. I am not kidding. A full-on clap. He barked that we were going to disrupt silos before mispronouncing half the department names and referring to the finance team as the Wallet Goblins. I remember watching from my corner of the conference table, sipping lukewarm coffee and thinking that he was going to break something expensive. It took him 2 days to rename our department Strategic Risk Synergies. It took him 3 days to schedule a transparency town hall, where he used a 5-slide presentation to explain that compliance is more of a vibe than a rule. By day 5, he had started pushing a new vendor through for approval. It was a consulting firm run by, you guessed it, his old roommate from college, a guy named Trent Mercer. Trent had no credentials, no real risk experience. Just a profile with words like visionary and scalability expert. Trent's big pitch was that he could automate our entire compliance process with just a few macros and a sprinkle of disruption. I asked him one question during our first meeting. I wanted to know his plan for handling security alignment across third-party integrations. He blinked like I had asked him to translate ancient symbols using hamsters, and then he called me intense. That was when Bradley started calling me out in general meetings. He would ask if we could not doomcast every change we made, or suggest we not get bogged down in bureaucracy. He even implied at one point that my tone was hostile to innovation. Imagine that. The man making sure our server logs do not turn into subpoenas is considered hostile because I would not let his college friend replace certified audit trails with spreadsheet files and good intentions. Still, I kept my head down. I focused on the audit, kept legal counsel in the loop, checked every box, and filed every form. I had seen loud managers come and go. They all hit the same wall eventually. The quiet infrastructure people they ignored are the ones who hold the keys. And my keys were the kind you do not notice until they are already gone. Bradley Cole did not walk down the corridors of our office, he announced himself. Every hallway became his personal runway, and you would always hear him before you saw him. He was constantly laughing too loud at his own jokes. It was the kind of performance laughter that sounded like a podcast no one had ever wanted to hear. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over, telling everyone that this was not their grandfather's operations team. Ironically, his constant repetition only made me miss my grandfather, who had a hyper-organized wooden toolbox in his garage where every single socket wrench was oiled and in its proper place. At least my grandfather understood the fundamental value of proper documentation and preparation. By the second week of his tenure, Bradley had already conducted 3 major meetings with external vendors without bothering to invite risk and compliance. I only found out about them because the legal team looped me in afterward, asking if Bradley had cleared the new vendor contracts through our system. He had not, of course. He did not even know we had a pre-vetting checklist for external partners. When legal questioned him, he told them to relax and claimed that I would simply rubber stamp the contracts later. He spoke my name as if I were a junior assistant, whose job was to fetch his sugar-free sodas without showing too much attitude. During our next weekly all-hands meeting, Bradley stood up and waved a printed proposal that contained so many trendy corporate buzzwords. I genuinely suspected it had been written by an artificial intelligence generator. He announced that we were onboarding Trent's firm, NovaCore Solutions, describing them as a next-generation, bleeding-edge partner that would revolutionize our compliance operations. The document used the word synergize 7 times, once as a verb and once as a noun, which I made sure to note. I raised my hand in front of the entire room. I asked if NovaCore Solutions had completed our mandatory third-party attestation forms, pointing out that we needed their security certifications verified before onboarding them. Furthermore, I reminded him that our upcoming liability insurance renewal required us to disclose any new consultants who were touching our compliance operations. Bradley waved his hand in the air, dismissing my questions as if I had asked him to solve quantum physics. He told the room not to worry, saying Trent was a disruptor, not a pencil pusher. He added that my level of concern seemed a little too intense for a seamless integration and urged us not to kill their momentum with paranoia. That word echoed in my ears all the way back to my cubicle. Paranoia is what arrogant people call due diligence, when they are too lazy to follow the rules that keep them out of court. A day later, I saw Trent sitting at the desk right outside Bradley's office. He had brought his dog into the building, an actual dog wearing a tiny customized sweater that read Compliance Pup. Trent was loudly bragging to our administrative assistant about how he had once streamlined a major client's vendor audit process by simply declaring trust as a core company value. Meanwhile, my inbox was filling up with urgent messages from our insurance representative, asking for our updated risk control matrix and proof of procedural segregation for the upcoming policy renewal. We had exactly 19 days left. I decided to confront Bradley directly in his office. I told him that his consultant lacked credentials, had no security review on file, and had not been disclosed to our insurer. I warned him that if we proceeded, our coverage could be flagged and we would be in direct violation of our own corporate policies. Bradley leaned back in his expensive office chair like a man who believed ergonomic support was a sign of executive dominance. He told me the company had survived long before I arrived and would continue to survive long after I left. He said he was hired to speed things up, not drown in red tape, and that Trent was going to clean up our outdated systems. I looked at him and said that if he was going to override our safety protocols, he needed to put that instruction in writing. His expression shifted instantly. It was the look of a man who realized he was being asked to sign his name to his own mistakes. That afternoon, I received a meeting invitation from Human Resources. 2 representatives I had never spoken to before read to me from a pre-written script. They told me that concerns had been raised regarding my resistance to change and my professional communication tone. When I asked for specific examples of this behavior, they claimed they were not permitted to share that information. I asked if the company had documented any formal reassignment of my responsibilities, and they stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. They assured me I was not being let go, claiming they were just creating space for a new operational strategy. but they expected me to support Trent during the transition. I did not agree, and I did not argue. I simply stood up and walked out of the room. When I got back to my desk, I logged into the compliance portal, verified that my name was still listed as the named assessor on our active liability policies, and printed the protocol document for notifying the insurer of material changes. Then I printed a single-page letter, signed it with my pen, and sealed it in a thick envelope. That letter was going to someone far more powerful than our human resources department. I received the phone call at exactly 8:14 on a Tuesday morning. Statistically speaking, that is the single worst time of the week to fire someone. You have not had your second cup of coffee, your inbox is overflowing, and the printer is jammed. Bradley's voice came through my headset sounding cheerful, like a man pretending not to enjoy what he was about to do. He asked me to pop into conference room B for a quick chat. That phrase should come with a legal warning. You never invite a veteran employee in for a quick chat unless there is going to be corporate blood on the carpet. Conference room B smelled of brand new carpeting and manufactured corporate empathy. Two human resources representatives were seated at the table. Bradley was leaning against the wall, arms crossed. His eyes lit up with that performative managerial sorrow you see right before someone tweets about making difficult decisions. He started by saying they decided to go in a different direction. I could have made a bingo card out of their hollow phrases. He told me I was great at my job, but the corporate culture was shifting toward agility and collaboration, and my legacy processes no longer aligned with their vision. I looked him in the eye and asked if by legacy processes he meant following federal regulations and insurance laws. He laughed nervously as if my response were just a joke and urged me not to make the situation adversarial. He added that I had been there a long time, but had created friction by resisting their new energy. The human resources representatives chimed in immediately, their voices overlapping, as they assured me they wanted to make my transition smooth. Bradley interrupted them, smiling as he mentioned cultural misalignment, declaring that to be the official reason for my departure. I did not fight them. I did not say a word in my defense. I just sat there, watching them try to look sympathetic, while Trent's voice carried faintly through the glass wall outside. He was already sitting in my office chair, adjusting my desk. The efficiency of the setup made it obvious that the decision had been rehearsed. They did not ask for my security badge because I placed it on the table before they could request it. They did not ask for my laptop password because I had already wiped every personal file. The only files I left untouched were the digital audit logs, because every administrative action I had ever taken was permanently archived. The human resources representatives stood up, relieved that I was not going to make a scene. They offered to escort me out of the building. I stood up calmly and told them I knew the procedure because I wrote it. I walked past Trent on my way to the elevator. He did not even look up, merely mumbling to Bradley about streamlining the data entry. I caught a quick glimpse of his monitor and had to suppress a laugh. He had my primary risk assessment dashboard open, staring at the underwriter's portal as if he were trying to decode an ancient language. The elevator doors shut before I allowed myself to feel any emotion. Anger wanted to break through, but I kept it locked down. Rage makes noise, but a proper plan does not. At home, I pulled the sealed envelope from my bag. It was a cream-colored envelope made of thick paper. Because serious correspondence requires physical weight, the envelope was addressed directly to the senior underwriter at Alliance Indemnity Group, the man I had collaborated with for years. He was the one who had once told me that my meticulous paperwork was the only reason our company's insurance files ever made sense to his auditing team. Inside was a single, clear sentence. It stated that effective immediately, I was no longer employed by the policyholder and therefore could no longer serve as the named assessor under the active coverage terms. This was not an act of spite. It was simply following the strict notification protocol that Bradley had failed to read. That is the beauty of paperwork. It does not care about charisma or corporate buzzwords. It only demands absolute precision. I sealed the envelope, wrote the date, and walked to the mailbox. The sound of the letter hitting the bottom of the metal box was soft and final. Then I went back inside, brewed a fresh pot of black coffee, and watched the rain run down my window. Somewhere across the cities, my name was still attached to every risk filing and active compliance certification. By the time the executives realized what that actually meant, it would be far too late to fix it. The first indication of trouble arrived 2 days after I mailed my letter. It was not a loud explosion, but rather a quiet whimper. At 6:48 in the morning, I received an email from our internal audit coordinator asking if I had moved the vendor research documents. I stared at the screen, sipping my coffee. The answer, of course, was that I had not moved anything. Trent simply did not know where the files were located, how to read our indexing tables, or that an indexing table even existed. Over the course of the following week, the tiny cracks began to spread like fractures across a glass windshield. The quarterly risk summary went out with 3 sections blank. Legal requested our data clearance matrix and received a document with 2 bullet points. And the phrase "to be determined." Someone else tried to generate a compliance report and called my personal number. Because the new dashboard Trent had launched had filtered out all third-party vendors, including the ones flagged for high security risks. I did not return their call. I just sat on my porch, enjoying the afternoon sun, and watched a squirrel. The collapse had officially begun. Bradley Cole marched into the quarterly board meeting, looking like a man who believed he had single-handedly solved the company's operational inefficiencies. A colleague in the finance department later told me that Bradley had actually high-fived Trent right outside the glass conference room. Trent was clutching a custom water bottle that had Chief Disruptor printed across the side. The room was completely full. The chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, several board members who had flown in from Chicago, and our lead venture capital representative dialing in from the West Coast were all waiting. They were there to listen to Bradley's first major risk and compliance update since my departure. He began his presentation with a dramatic click of his remote, smiling warmly at the board. He announced that under his new operational leadership, they had modernized their risk procedures, eliminated redundant checkpoints, and adopted an agile model. His presentation slides were filled with colorful graphics and graphs that had no labels but featured aggressive upward arrows. He boasted that they had reduced audit friction by 38% and eliminated unnecessary control loops. Bradley then clicked to a slide with a giant green check mark that read "Insurer Aligned." That slide was particularly amusing because Bradley was entirely unaware of the legal reality. My name was still listed on the underlying compliance documents that their policy renewal depended on. Trent had never reviewed those filings, and Bradley had ignored them completely. The board was impressed, and one member even suggested using Bradley's dashboard as a template for their entire portfolio. Then came the turning point. An older board member who had been quietly taking notes on a yellow legal pad looked up. He asked if these operational adjustments had been formally cleared through their certified assessor of record. Bradley did not blink. He replied that they were fully aligned on all fronts and could not have asked for a smoother transition. He lied directly to the board to secure the next funding round. The very next afternoon, Preston Pierce, the senior legal counsel for Alliance Indemnity Group, arrived at our headquarters. He was not there to celebrate. He sat at the end of the boardroom table with a thick leather folder and the quiet intensity of an attorney who knows he holds all the cards. I was not in the building, but my phone started buzzing with text messages from former colleagues within. 15 minutes. Preston Pierce waited until Bradley finished his standard speech about compliance being a corporate mindset. The lawyer clicked his pen once and stated that he needed to clarify a few details regarding their active policy renewal. He asked who had authorized the termination of the named assessor. Bradley, still smiling, answered that he had. Mentioning my name and claiming I had been reassigned, Preston Pierce closed his leather folder. The room went completely silent for 15 full seconds. The lawyer looked directly at Bradley and asked if he had personally initiated the termination of the one individual whose certification was required for active coverage without providing the mandatory prior notice to the insurer. Bradley tried to defend himself, but his voice faltered. The lawyer explained that our active policy had been flagged because my status was listed as inactive. Yet no formal notification or replacement assessor had been submitted. Consequently, their corporate liability coverage was suspended retroactively to the date of my termination, which was exactly 3 weeks ago. The chief executive officer turned pale and asked if this would affect their coverage. Preston Pierce responded that until a certified named assessor was formally reinstated and approved by his office, they had no active liability insurance. The lawyer pulled a single sheet of paper from his folder and slid it across the table. He cited Clause 11B of the enterprise policy, which stated that any change to the named assessor required 30 days prior written notice. Because they had fired me without notice, every compliance summary and certification signed by Trent during the lapse window was void ab initio, meaning legally invalid from the very beginning. Furthermore, Preston Pierce pointed out that by representing their compliance operations as fully aligned to secure a funding round while their coverage was suspended, the company had committed a material breach. This exposed the firm to potential fraud claims and the board members to personal liability for a breach of fiduciary duty. To make matters worse, Trent had attempted to submit risk reports using my electronic system credentials after my departure. Under California Penal Code Section 470 and federal wire fraud statutes, using another individual's digital signature without authorization is a felony. The chief executive officer stared at the paper as his hands began to tremble. Bradley sat frozen, his buzzwords suddenly useless against the weight of federal statutes and insurance law. The first phone call from the chief executive officer arrived at exactly 7 in the morning. I let it ring. He did not leave a voicemail, but I recognized the corporate number immediately. He was never an early riser, so calling me before breakfast meant the executive team had run out of cards to play. An hour later, an email from their legal department landed in my inbox under the subject line Reinstatement Opportunity. The message was filled with polite, diplomatic phrases like collaborative reconciliation and exploring mutual solutions. They offered to restore my prior position with a 10% salary increase, retroactive back pay, stock options, and increased operational autonomy. I stared at the screen, took a slow sip of my coffee, and typed a brief reply. I wrote that under Clause 11C of our active liability policy, the reinstatement of a named assessor following an unauthorized termination required formal written pre-clearance from the assessor, including revised oversight terms. I informed them that I would require a completely new contract and instructed them to direct all future communications to my attorney. My attorney, a sharp contract specialist who did not believe in corporate politeness, drafted a list of requirements. First, my compensation would be double my former salary, billed as a consulting fee to Vance Risk Advisory LLC. Second, I would have absolute veto authority over any vendor onboarding, with no override option for the operations director. Third, the company would provide full indemnification for any liability arising during the 3-week period when Bradley and Trent had run their unauthorized experiments on our compliance systems. Finally, the board members themselves had to sign a resolution acknowledging their personal liability if they ever attempted to bypass compliance protocols again. 10 minutes later, the chief executive officer called again. I let it ring. While they were scrambling to fix their self-inflicted disaster, I knew that Alliance Indemnity Group had already frozen their policy renewal. Preston Pierce was not wasting time. His office had flagged every single client agreement touched in the last 30 days for compliance violations. This included 2 major pilot programs, a critical government subcontract, and a high-value contract with a biotech company whose legal department filed data breach notices like grocery lists. What the board had never realized was that every time I certified our risk posture, I also archived the entire legal context, timestamps, and software versions. Trent did not even know that level of tracking existed. The board held an emergency session that afternoon. Bradley Cole was noticeably absent from the office, with whispers circulating that he had been suspended pending a formal investigation into his conduct. Trent was nowhere to be found, and his compliance dashboard had been disabled. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my attorney's office, reviewing the final draft of our counter-proposal. We had established Vance Risk Advisory LLC as an independent consultancy, and our terms were non-negotiable. The next morning, I walked into the corporate boardroom. The atmosphere was completely different from the day I was escorted out. The silence in the room was not the eager, performative quiet that employees give a visiting executive. It was a fragile, tense silence. I wore a simple charcoal gray sweater, carrying a black binder containing version 7.0 of our updated security protocols. Preston Pierce was already seated at the end of the table and gave me a respectful nod. The chief executive officer looked as though he had not slept in days. The chief financial officer sat next to him, staring at his tablet, nervously refreshing the investor portal. The lead venture capitalist was on the video screen, silent, his face grim. Bradley's nameplate was gone from the table, replaced by a blank space that felt like a tombstone for his short-lived operational revolution. No one spoke as I took my seat. The lawyer addressed the board, stating that my signature on the updated independent consulting agreement satisfied the underwriter's requirements to lift the suspension and restore their coverage. I slid the heavy binder across the table. The chief executive officer looked at it and muttered that it looked much thicker than before. I looked him in the eye and replied that it was much meaner. Preston Pierce smiled. A board member turned to the signature page, where my name was printed as Gavin Scott Vance, named Assessor of Record, Vance Risk Advisory LLC. The chief executive officer looked at me with relief and whispered that I had saved them. I shook my head and replied that I had not saved them. I had simply refused to let them burn the company down. There was no applause or celebration, just the heavy silence of executives realizing that the quiet professionals they had dismissed as an obstacle was the only person keeping their business alive. I did not need corporate appreciation or empty praise. The silence in that room was the only compensation I required. You are the real MVPs of the office jungle. Thanks for watching. Smash that subscribe button or the coffee pot might just forget your next brew.